The most valuable gemstones right now don't look the way they're supposed to. Not perfectly clear, not deep blue, not traditionally rare. Instead, the spotlight is shifting towards something warmer, almost unpredictable. A soft peach crystal appearing in curated collections, a molten orange stone becoming harder to source, a color so rare it doesn't even fit standard grading. Individually, they don't make sense. Together, they form a pattern, and when collectors start moving in the same direction without saying why, it's usually because the market already knows something. The first signal didn't come from a headline. It came from a stone most people would have ignored. Don't forget to press and hold that like button, leave a comment, and hit subscribe before we begin. Ranked 10th, Padparadscha Sapphire. At the center of this transformation is a gemstone that has never fit comfortably within the traditional rules of value. Padparadscha Sapphire. For decades, its position in the market remained uncertain, not because it lacked rarity, but because it resisted definition. Neither distinctly pink nor fully orange, it occupies a narrow range of color where precision matters more than intensity. In a system that historically rewarded clarity, uniformity, and easily classified traits, that ambiguity limited its visibility. Today, that ambiguity has become its strength. Across the global luxury investment market, the criteria that define value are beginning to shift. The focus is moving away from standardized perfection and toward characteristics that are far more difficult to replicate. Padparadscha Sapphire sits precisely at that point of transition where rarity is not just about scarcity, but about balance. No two stones present the same relationship between pink and orange. No two deposits produce identical tones. That variability, once viewed as inconsistency, is now recognized as distinction. And in a market increasingly driven by uniqueness, that distinction carries measurable weight. This change is not theoretical. Auction behavior, private collector activity, and dealer positioning all point in the same direction. Assets that require expertise to identify are gaining traction over those that rely on widely recognized standards. Padparadscha Sapphire demands that level of understanding. Subtle differences in hue, treatment, and origin can dramatically alter its classification and long-term value. At the same time, supply remains tightly constrained. Fine, untreated examples continue to emerge from a limited number of regions, with no meaningful expansion in output. As visibility increases and availability narrows, the conditions that define high-value assets begin to align. Padparadscha does not dominate through volume or widespread recognition. It dominates through signal. It marks the point where the market begins to redefine what is considered valuable, where emotional resonance, visual complexity, and scarcity intersect. And as that signal strengthens, it extends beyond a single gemstone, influencing how the broader category of warm-toned stones is perceived within the luxury space. This is how markets evolve, not through sudden disruption, but through quiet shifts that gradually reshape where attention and capital flows. And once that shift reaches critical mass, what was once overlooked becomes impossible to ignore. Ranked 9th, Orange Sapphires. There is a line in this market that is rarely visible at first glance, but it defines everything that follows. Nowhere is that line more evident than in orange sapphires. At a distance, many of these stones appear indistinguishable from their more valuable counterparts. The same warm spectrum, the same visual appeal, the same immediate association with rarity. Yet beneath that surface lies a critical divide, one that separates enduring value from temporary demand. Treatment, heat enhancement, diffusion processes, and other interventions have become increasingly common in the pursuit of achieving ideal color. In many cases, these methods are not easily detected without advanced testing. To the untrained eye, a treated orange sapphire can mirror the appearance of a far rarer, untreated stone, but the market does not value them equally. Untreated orange sapphires, those that achieve their color through natural geological conditions, remain scarce and highly selective. Their pricing reflects not just appearance, but authenticity. Treated stones, regardless of how visually compelling they may seem, exist in a different category altogether. This distinction becomes more significant as attention towards sunset-hued gemstones continues to grow. Increased demand inevitably brings increased supply, but not all supply carries the same integrity. As more buyers enter the space, the gap between perception and reality begins to widen. Stones that appear aligned with the trend may in fact fall outside the criteria that define long-term collectability. This is where the market becomes less forgiving. Subtle differences in origin, treatment history, and color composition begin to determine outcomes. What appears to be a rare acquisition can, over time, reveal itself as a commodity-level asset. And unlike more standardized gemstones where benchmarks are widely understood, sunset tone stones often require deeper expertise to evaluate accurately. Orange sapphire represents this tension with particular clarity. It sits close enough to the center of the trend to attract attention, yet far enough from uniform standards to introduce uncertainty. That combination makes it both compelling and risky. As the broader shift toward warm-toned gemstones accelerates, this layer of complexity becomes unavoidable. Because in a market defined by nuance, value is not simply discovered, it is distinguished. And for those navigating this space, that distinction is where the real difference is made. Ranked 8th, yellow diamonds. Long before a shift becomes obvious to the broader market, it tends to appear in a different place, within the decisions of institutions that rarely move without reason. In recent years, that signal has become increasingly visible through the positioning of yellow diamonds. For decades, the hierarchy within diamonds remained largely unchanged. Colorless stones dominated the upper tiers of value, while colored diamonds, outside of rare pinks and blues, occupied a more specialized space. Yellow diamonds, despite their natural warmth, were often viewed as secondary within that structure. That perception is beginning to change. Auction houses have started to adjust how these stones are presented, moving high-quality, fancy vivid, and fancy deep yellow diamonds into more prominent placements. Their visibility is no longer limited to niche segments of catalogs. Instead, they are being framed as central pieces, supported by detailed provenance, emphasized color grading, and strategic positioning alongside other high-value lots. This is not a superficial adjustment. It reflects a recalibration of what the market is prepared to recognize as significant. Unlike many other gemstones, diamonds operate within a highly structured grading system. Color intensity, clarity, and cut are evaluated through standardized frameworks that leave little room for ambiguity. When a category within that system begins to gain prominence, it signals more than aesthetic preference. It suggests a shift in how value is being measured at scale. Yellow diamonds embody that shift with precision. Their warmth aligns with the broader movement towards sunset-toned gemstones, but their inclusion within the diamond category introduces an additional layer of legitimacy. They bridge two worlds, the established authority of diamonds and the emerging appeal of warmer color palettes. This dual position makes them particularly influential. Collectors who might otherwise remain anchored to traditional assets are finding a pathway into the same visual spectrum that defines stones like Padparadscha Sapphire or Spessartite Garnet, without leaving the structural familiarity of diamonds. As a result, capital begins to move differently. What was once considered an alternative aesthetic is now being integrated into the core of luxury portfolios. And when that integration is supported by institutions through auctions, pricing behavior, and curated visibility, it carries weight beyond individual transactions. Yellow diamonds are not simply following the trend, they are validating it. And when validation reaches this level, the shift it represents becomes far more difficult to reverse. Ranked 7th, Citrine. Momentum in any emerging category tends to create a familiar illusion, the assumption that everything within that category will rise together. In the case of sunset-hued gemstones, that assumption does not hold. Citrine sits directly within the same visual spectrum that is driving increased attention across the market. Its warm, golden tones, ranging from pale amber to deeper orange hues, align closely with the aesthetic that collectors are beginning to favor. At a glance, it appears to belong to the same movement, yet its position tells a very different story. Unlike stones such as Padparadscha Sapphire or fine Spessartite Garnet, Citrine exists in abundant supply. Large deposits across multiple regions have made it widely accessible for decades. Its availability has supported its role in commercial jewelry, but that same accessibility has limited its progression into the upper tiers of collectability. In markets where scarcity defines value, abundance introduces a ceiling. This creates a clear contradiction. Visual alignment alone is not sufficient to elevate a gemstone into the investment category. Two stones may share a similar color profile, yet occupy entirely different positions within the market depending on origin, rarity, and historical demand. Citrine illustrates this distinction with unusual clarity. Despite benefiting from the same shift toward warmer tones, it remains largely excluded from the movement that is driving capital into more selective stones. Its pricing behavior reflects stability rather than escalation, and its role continues to be defined by accessibility rather than exclusivity. This divergence is not a weakness in the broader trend, it is a defining feature of it. As attention increases, the market becomes more selective, not less. Boundaries that may have once seemed fluid begin to solidify. Stones that meet the criteria of rarity, nuance, and constrained supply separate from those that do not, even when their visual characteristics overlap. The result is a landscape where perception alone becomes unreliable. Understanding the difference between alignment and inclusion becomes essential. A gemstone may appear to fit the narrative, yet remain outside the forces that are actually shaping value. Citrine stands as a reminder of that boundary. And in a market undergoing quiet transformation, recognizing where that boundary exists can matter as much as recognizing the trend itself. Ranked 6th, Heliodor. Movement at the edges of a market rarely stays contained. When a pattern begins to repeat across regions that do not traditionally overlap, it signals something larger than isolated demand. Heliodor provides a clear example of that expansion. As a golden variety of beryl, it has long existed outside the primary focus of high-end collectors. Its color, ranging from pale yellow to deeper honey tones, places it firmly within the warm spectrum, yet for years it remained secondary to more established stones. Limited recognition, rather than limited supply, defined its position. That dynamic is beginning to change. Interest in Heliodor has started to emerge across markets that operate with different cultural and economic drivers. In parts of Asia and the Middle East, where gold tones carry long-standing association with wealth and continuity, the stone's coloration aligns naturally with existing preferences. At the same time, Western collectors, particularly those seeking alternatives to saturated or heavily marketed gemstones, are beginning to explore materials that offer a quieter form of distinction. This convergence creates a different type of demand. Unlike trends driven by a single region or demographic, this movement reflects multiple entry points into the same category. Buyers are not responding to a coordinated narrative, but to a shared set of characteristics: warmth, versatility, and the ability to exist outside rigid hierarchies. Heliodor benefits from that shift precisely because it does not carry the weight of expectation. It is not bound by the historical benchmarks that define sapphires or diamonds. Its value is being interpreted in real time, shaped by how different markets perceive its potential rather than how it has been traditionally positioned. This introduces both opportunity and complexity. Without a standardized framework guiding its evaluation, Heliodor's role within the luxury market remains fluid. Certain stones, those with exceptional clarity, deeper saturation, and traceable origins, are beginning to separate from the broader category. Others remain closer to their commercial roots. As attention continues to spread, these distinctions are likely to become more pronounced. What matters is not the scale of the current market, but the direction of its movement. When multiple regions begin to engage with the same material for different reasons, it suggests a form of resilience that isolated demand cannot sustain. Heliodor does not dominate through visibility. It expands through reach, and in a market where influence often follows geography, that expansion becomes a signal in itself. Ranked 5th, Imperial Topaz. Color has always influenced perception, but within the luxury gemstone market, certain colors carry weight far beyond aesthetics. They activate associations that shape how value is interpreted, often before rarity or origin is even considered. Imperial Topaz sits precisely within that space. Its warm spectrum, ranging from golden amber to deep orange with subtle reddish undertones, aligns closely with visual cues that have long been linked to wealth, stability, and legacy. Unlike cooler tones, which convey precision and formality, these warmer hues evoke something less structured but more enduring: continuity, warmth, and permanence. That distinction matters. In high-value markets, purchasing decisions are rarely driven by logic alone. They are influenced by how an object feels to own, to wear, and to pass forward. Stones that carry emotional resonance tend to hold attention longer, particularly among collectors who are no longer motivated solely by traditional markers of status. Imperial Topaz benefits from this shift because it operates at the intersection of history and perception. Historically associated with royalty, particularly in regions where warm tones symbolize power and divine favor, it carries an inherited narrative that extends beyond its physical properties. That narrative, once secondary to more standardized gemstones, is now being reevaluated as collectors seek assets that communicate more than technical perfection. At the same time, its coloration reflects a broader preference emerging across multiple categories within luxury goods. From fashion to interior design, warmer palettes have begun to replace cooler, more neutral tones. This alignment across industries reinforces the gemstone's relevance, positioning it within a wider cultural movement rather than isolating it as a niche interest. Yet the psychological impact of Imperial Topaz is not defined by intensity alone. Subtlety plays an equally important role. The most sought-after stones are not those that appear exaggerated, but those that achieve a precise balance, where color feels natural rather than forced. This nuance mirrors the qualities that are increasingly valued in other high-end assets: authenticity, restraint, and depth. As attention shifts toward these attributes, the criteria used to evaluate gemstones begins to evolve. Imperial Topaz does not dominate through visibility or volume. It resonates through association. And in a market where perception shapes demand, that resonance becomes a driving force behind the broader movement towards sunset-hued stones. Ranked fourth, Fire Opal. Supply, more than demand, often determines where a market begins to tighten. When availability becomes unpredictable, perception shifts quickly, especially in categories where consistency is already difficult to maintain. Fire Opal reflects this dynamic with unusual clarity. Unlike many gemstones that rely on external brilliance, Fire Opal is defined by its internal glow. Its body color, ranging from bright orange to deep reddish tones, appears to radiate from within the stone itself. This quality is not easily replicated, and it depends heavily on specific geological conditions that occur in relatively limited regions, most notably in Mexico. For years, that geographic concentration provided stability. Production remained consistent enough to support commercial demand, while higher quality material moved selectively through collector channels. That balance has begun to change. Extraction conditions have become less predictable. Certain deposits that once produced vivid, high-clarity stones are yielding fewer pieces that meet those standards. At the same time, increased attention toward warm-toned gemstones has begun to redirect interest toward Fire Opal, placing additional pressure on an already constrained supply. This convergence alters the structure of the market. When demand rises against the narrowing pipeline of quality material, differentiation accelerates. Stones that might once have been grouped together begin to separate into distinct tiers. Fine specimens, those with strong saturation, minimal inclusions, and stable color, become significantly more difficult to replace. This is where scarcity becomes visible, not as a sudden absence, but as a gradual tightening that affects availability at the highest levels first. Dealers adjust their expectations. Collectors become more selective. Transactions shift from open availability to more discrete exchanges, where access is often limited by network rather than price alone. Fire Opal occupies a unique position within this environment. It aligns visually with the broader movement towards sunset hues, yet its supply constraints introduce a level of urgency that is not uniformly present across the category. That combination increases its relevance, particularly among buyers who recognize how quickly conditions can change once a market reaches this stage. However, scarcity alone does not define value. Consistency, origin, and structural integrity remain critical. Stones that lack these attributes may not follow the same trajectory, even as attention increases. What Fire Opal demonstrates is not simply that supply is tightening. It shows how quickly a market can respond when that tightening begins to intersect with rising demand. Ranked third, Spessartite Garnet. Patterns in the luxury gemstone market rarely become visible through appearance alone. Color may attract attention, but it is pricing behavior, quiet, incremental, and often overlooked, that confirms whether a shift is actually taking place. Spessartite Garnet offers a measurable example of that confirmation. Characterized by its vivid orange to reddish orange tones, Spessartite has long occupied a specialized position within the garnet family. Its visual intensity has always been distinctive, yet for many years, it remained underrepresented in high-value transactions compared to more established gemstones. That positioning is beginning to change in ways that can be observed through market behavior rather than isolated commentary. Over the past decade, fine quality spessartite, particularly stones with strong saturation, high clarity, and traceable origin, has demonstrated a steady upward movement in valuation within collector circles. This progression has not been driven by sudden spikes or speculative surges, but by a consistent narrowing of availability at the upper end of the quality spectrum. Such movement tends to follow a recognizable pattern. Initial demand emerges from a small group of informed buyers. As availability of top-tier material becomes less predictable, competition for those pieces increases. Pricing adjusts gradually, often without drawing widespread attention. Only after this cycle has been underway for some time does broader recognition begin to follow. Spessartite appears to be moving through that exact phase. Dealers specializing in high-grade material have reported increased selectivity among buyers, with greater emphasis placed on color purity and origin. Stones that meet these criteria are being held longer, traded more discreetly, and priced with a level of confidence that was less common in previous cycles. This behavior reflects more than isolated interest. It suggests that spessartite is being evaluated within a different framework, one that aligns it more closely with the characteristics defining high-value sunset-hued gemstones. Its color intensity, once considered unconventional, now fits within a broader aesthetic that is gaining traction across the luxury market. At the same time, supply remains finite. Significant deposits are geographically limited, and production of top-quality material has not expanded in proportion to increasing demand. This combination, steady price movement, constrained availability, and rising selectivity, forms a data-driven foundation for the trend. Spessartite does not rely on visibility to establish its position. It establishes it through behavior, and in markets where capital tends to follow patterns rather than narratives, that behavior becomes one of the clearest indicators that a shift is already in motion. Ranked second, Morganite. Momentum in high-end gemstone markets is often assumed to follow rarity. The rarer the stone, the more attention it commands. Yet certain movements challenge that assumption, not by contradicting it entirely, but by introducing a different path to relevance. Morganite represents one of those exceptions. As a member of the beryl family, it shares structural similarities with more established stones such as emerald and aquamarine. Its defining characteristic, however, lies in its soft pink to peach coloration, tones that align directly with the broader shift toward warmer, sunset-inspired palettes. Despite this alignment, Morganite has never been considered rare in the traditional sense. Deposits are relatively accessible, and production levels have historically supported consistent supply. For many years, this positioned it firmly within the commercial jewelry category, rather than among collector-grade assets. That classification is beginning to blur. Demand for Morganite has increased in ways that are not entirely explained by scarcity. Instead, its rise appears tied to a different set of factors, ones that are increasingly influential within the luxury market. Its coloration offers versatility, pairing easily with both contemporary and classic design aesthetics. Its clarity often allows for larger stones, enhancing visual presence without requiring exceptional rarity. More importantly, it aligns with evolving buyer preferences. A growing segment of collectors and consumers is placing value on individuality and visual identity over strict adherence to traditional hierarchies. Morganite fits within that framework by offering a distinct aesthetic that feels current without relying on legacy status. This does not position it as a direct competitor to high-end gemstones defined by scarcity. Instead, it occupies a parallel role. Its presence within the market expands the definition of what can attract sustained attention. While stones like Padparadscha Sapphire or Spessartite Garnet derive their significance from rarity and constrained supply, Morganite demonstrates how demand can also be driven by accessibility combined with strong visual appeal. That combination creates a different type of momentum, one that moves through design houses, retail visibility, and consumer preference before entering more selective channels. As awareness increases, certain higher quality stones, those with exceptional color saturation and clarity, begin to separate from the broader category, hinting at a gradual shift in perception. Morganite does not dominate through exclusivity. It gains ground through adoption. And in a market undergoing quiet transformation, widespread adoption can be just as influential as rarity in shaping where attention begins to move next. In first place, peach tone tourmaline. Recognition in the luxury gemstone market rarely begins where attention is already focused. It tends to surface in quieter corners, where selection is deliberate and patterns form before they are widely acknowledged. Peach tone tourmaline has long existed within that quieter space. Its coloration, balance between soft orange and muted pink, places it firmly within the warm spectrum, now gaining traction across high-end markets. Yet unlike more established gemstones, it has historically operated without a clearly defined position. It carries neither the legacy hierarchy of sapphires nor the standardized frameworks that support diamonds. For years, that lack of definition limited its visibility. What is changing is not the stone itself, but the context in which it is being evaluated. Selective appearances of peach tourmaline have begun to increase within curated collections, settings where inclusion reflects intention rather than abundance. These placements are not driven by volume or accessibility, but by alignment with a broader shift in aesthetic and value perception. The change is subtle, but it is consistent. And consistency at this level of the market is rarely accidental. Collectors who traditionally focused on well-established categories are beginning to incorporate stones that exist outside those boundaries. Dealers are adjusting inventory strategies, introducing materials that emphasize color nuance over rigid classification. These decisions, taken independently, begin to form a recognizable pattern. Peach tourmaline sits at the early edge of that pattern. Its appeal does not rely on extreme rarity or historical prestige. Instead, it reflects a developing preference, one that favors complexity, warmth, and individuality over uniform perfection. Stones are no longer judged solely by how closely they match a predefined ideal, but by how distinctly they differentiate themselves within a broader category. At this stage, the movement remains understated. It does not yet dominate auction headlines or define market benchmarks, but its presence across selective channels suggests that attention is beginning to concentrate in a new direction, one that extends beyond a single gemstone. And in the luxury investment market, attention rarely remains isolated. It tends to move, first quietly, then collectively, and when that movement begins to align across multiple stones within the same visual spectrum, it signals something far more significant than preference. It signals the early formation of dominance. The market didn't change overnight. It adjusted piece by piece, a color here, a preference there, until the pattern became impossible to ignore. These 10 gemstones don't just share a palette, they share timing. They're appearing at the same moment, in the same conversations, under the same conditions that tend to shape long-term value. But patterns like this don't stay hidden forever. They either accelerate or they disappear. And knowing the difference is what separates attention from understanding.